讀你聽嘅時間，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 讀到 Part 2嘅第59節。呢一節嘅名叫做 Wherein is related the strange thing which may be regarded as an adventure that happened Don Quixote。咁上一回就講到 Don Quixote 同 Sancho 喺道路上面做攔路人，攔住過客，就要佢哋拜伏喺佢哋啱啱先至遇見嘅兩位年輕貌美嘅少女，迷倒喺佢哋嘅美色之下，可以話係不可理喻。咁但係最後就俾過路者橫衝直撞，將佢哋撞飛，連人帶馬就撞到佢哋垂頭喪氣啦。我哋睇下呢一節垂頭喪氣上路嘅侍從兩人點樣重振雄風啊。
A clear, limpid spring which they discovered in a cool grove relieved Don Quixote and Sancho of the dust and fatigue due to the unpolite behavior of the bulls, and by the side of this, having turned Dapple and Rocinante loose without headstall or bridle, the forlorn pair, master and men, seated themselves. Sancho had recourse to the larder of his alforjas and took out of them what he called the prog. Don Quixote rinsed his mouth and bathed his face, by which cooling process his flagging energies were revived. Out of pure vexation he remained without eating, and out of pure politeness Sancho did not venture to touch a morsel of what was before him, but waited for his master to act as taster. Seeing, however, that, absorbed in thought, he was forgetting to carry the bread to his mouth, he said never a word, and trampling every sort of good breeding underfoot, began to stow away in his paunch the bread and cheese that came to his hand. Eat, Sancho, my friend, said Don Quixote, support life, which is of more consequence to thee than to me, and leave me to die under the pain of my thoughts and pressure of my misfortunes. I was born, Sancho, to live dying, and thou to die eating. And to prove the truth of what I say, look at me, printed in histories, famed in arms, courteous in behavior, honored by princes, courted by maidens, and after all, when I look forward to palms, triumphs, and crowns, won and earned by my valiant deeds, I have this morning seen myself trampled on, kicked, and crushed by the feet of unclean and filthy animals. This thought blunts my teeth, paralyzes my jaws, cramps my hands, and robs me of all appetite for food, so much so that I have a mind to let myself die of hunger, the cruelest death of all deaths. So then, said Sancho, munching hard all the time, your worship does not agree with the proverb that says, let Martha die, but let her die with a full belly. I, at any rate, have no mind to kill myself. So far from that, I mean to do as the cobbler does, who stretches the leather with his teeth until he makes it reach as far as he wants. I'll stretch out my life by eating until it reaches the end heaven has fixed for it. And let me tell you, Signor, there's no greater folly than to think of dying of despair as your worship does. Take my advice, and after eating, lie down and sleep a bit on this green grass mattress, and you will see that when you awake, you'll feel something better. Don Quixote did as he recommended, for it struck him that Sancho's reasoning was more like a philosopher's than a blockhead's, and said he, Sancho, if thou wilt do for me what I am going to tell thee, my ease of mind would be more assured, and my heaviness of heart not so great. And it is this, to go aside a little while I am sleeping in accordance with thy advice, and, making bare thy carcass to the air, to give thyself 300 or 400 lashes with Rocinante's reins, on account of the 3,000 and odd thou art to give thyself for the disenchantment of Dulcinea. For it is a great pity that the poor lady should be left enchanted through thy carelessness and negligence. There is a good deal to be said on that point, said Sancho. Let us both go to sleep now, and after that God has decreed what will happen. Let me tell your worship that for a man to whip himself in cold blood is a hard thing, especially if the stripes fall upon an ill-nourished and worse-fed body. Let my lady Dulcinea have patience, and when she is least expecting it, she will see me made a riddle of with whipping, and until death it's all life. I mean that I have still life in me, and a desire to make good what I have promised." Don Quixote thanked him, and ate a little, and Sancho a good deal, and then they both lay down to sleep, leaving those two inseparable friends and comrades, Rocinante and Dapple, to their own devices and to feed unrestrained upon the abundant grass with which the meadow was furnished. They woke up rather late, mounted once more, and resumed their journey, pushing on to reach an inn which was in sight, apparently a league off. I say an inn because Don Quixote called it so, contrary to his usual practice of calling all inns castles. They reached it, and asked the landlord if they could put up there. He said yes, with as much comfort and as good fare as they could find in Saragossa. They dismounted, and Sancho stowed away his larder in a room of which the landlord gave him the key. He took the beasts to the stable, fed them, and came back to see what orders Don Quixote, who was seated on a bench at the door, had for him, giving special thanks to heaven that this inn had not been taken for a castle by his master. Supper time came, and they repaired to their room, and Sancho asked the landlord what he had to give them for supper. To this the landlord replied that his mouth should be the measure. He had only to ask what he would, for that inn was provided with the birds of the air, and the fowls of the earth, and the fish of the sea. "There's no need of all that," said Sancho. "If they roast us a couple of chickens, we'll be satisfied, for my master is delicate and eats little, and I'm not over and above gluttonous." The landlord replied he had no chickens, for the kites had stolen them. "Well then," said Sancho, "let Signor Landlord tell them to roast a pullet, so that it is a tender one." "Pullet, my father," said the landlord. "Indeed, in truth, it's only yesterday I sent over 50 to the city to sell, but saving pullets, ask what you will." "In that case," said Sancho, "you will not be without veal or kid." "Just now," said the landlord, "there's none in the house, for it's all finished, but next week there'll be enough and to spare." "Much good that does us," said Sancho. "I'll lay a bet that all these shortcomings are going to wind up in plenty of bacon and eggs." "By God," said the landlord, "my guest's wits must be precious dull. I tell him I have neither pullets nor hens, and he wants me to have eggs. Talk of other dainties, if you please, and don't ask for hens again." "Body o' me," said Sancho, "let's settle the matter. Say at once what you've got, and let us have no more words about it." "In truth and earnest, Signor Guest," said the landlord, "all I have is a couple of cow heels like calf's feet, or a couple of calf's feet like calf heels. They are boiled with chickpeas, onions, and bacon, and at this moment they are crying, 'Come eat me, come eat me.'" "I mark them for mine on the spot," said Sancho. "Let nobody touch them. I'll pay better for them than anyone else, for I could not wish for anything more to my taste, and I don't care a pin whether they are feet or heels." "Nobody shall touch them," said the landlord, "for the other guests I have, being persons of high quality, bring their own cook and caterer and larder with them." "If you come to people of quality," said Sancho, "there's nobody more so than my master, but the calling he follows does not allow of larders or storerooms. We lay ourselves down in the middle of the meadow, and fill ourselves with acorns and medlars." Here ended Sancho's conversation with the landlord, Sancho not caring to carry it any farther by answering him, for he had already asked him what calling or what profession it was his master was of. Supper time having come, then Don Quixote betook himself to his room. The landlord brought in the stew-pan just as it was, and he set himself down to sup very resolutely. It seems that in another room, which was next to Don Quixote's, with nothing but a thin partition to separate it, he overheard these words: "As you live, Signor Don Geronimo, while they are bringing supper, let us read another chapter of the second part of Don Quixote of La Mancha." The instant Don Quixote heard his own name, he started to his feet and listened with open ears to catch what they said about him, and heard the Don Geronimo, who had been addressed, say in reply, "Why would you have us read that absurd stuff, Don Juan, when it is impossible for anyone who has read the first part of the history of Don Quixote of La Mancha to take any pleasure in reading this second part?" "For all that," said he who was addressed as Don Juan, "we shall do well to read it, for there is no book so bad but it has something good in it. What displeases me most in it is that it represents Don Quixote as now cured of his love for Dulcinea del Toboso. On hearing this, Don Quixote, full of wrath and indignation, lifted up his voice and said, "Whoever he may be who says that Don Quixote of La Mancha has forgotten or can forget Dulcinea del Toboso, I will teach him with equal arms that what he says is very far from the truth. For neither can the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso be forgotten, nor can forgetfulness have a place in Don Quixote. His motto is constancy, and his profession to maintain the same with his life and never wrong it." "Who is this that answers us?" said they in the next room. "Who should it be," said Sancho, "but Don Quixote of La Mancha himself, who will make good all he has said and all he will say, for pledges don't trouble a good payer." Sancho had hardly uttered these words when two gentlemen, for such they seemed to be, entered the room, and one of them, throwing his arms round Don Quixote's neck, said to him, "Your appearance cannot leave any question as to your name, nor can your name fail to identify your appearance. Unquestionably, senor, you are the real Don Quixote of La Mancha, cynosure and morning star of knight-errantry, despite and in defiance of him who has sought to usurp your name and bring to naught your achievements, as the author of this book which I here present to you has done." And with this he put a book which his companion carried into the hands of Don Quixote, who took it, and without replying began to run his eye over it. But he presently returned it, saying, "In the little I have seen, I have discovered 3 things in this author that deserve to be censored. The first is some words that I have read in the preface. The next, that the language is Aragonese, for sometimes he writes without articles. And the third, which above all stamps him as ignorant, is that he goes wrong and departs from the truth in the most important part of the history. For here he says that my squire Sancho Panza's wife is called Mari Gutierrez, when she is called nothing of the sort, but Teresa Panza. And when a man errs on such an important point as this, there is good reason to fear that he is in error on every other point in the history." "A nice sort of historian indeed," exclaimed Sancho at this. "He must know a deal about our affairs when he calls my wife Teresa Panza Mari Gutierrez. Take the book again, senor, and see if I am in it and if he has changed my name." "From your talk, friend," said Don Geronimo, "no doubt you are Sancho Panza, Senor Don Quixote's squire." "Yes, I am," said Sancho, "and I'm proud of it." "Faith, then," said the gentleman, "this new author does not handle you with the decency that displays itself in your person. He makes you out a heavy feeder and a fool, and not in the least droll, and a very different being from the Sancho described in the first part of your master's history." "God forgive him," said Sancho. "He might have left me in my corner without troubling his head about me. Let him who knows how ring the bells. St. Peter is very well in Rome." The two gentlemen pressed Don Quixote to come into their room and have supper with them, as they knew very well there was nothing in that inn fit for one of his sort. Don Quixote, who was always polite, yielded to their request and supped with them. Sancho stayed behind with the stew, and invested with plenary delegated authority seated himself at the head of the table, and the landlord sat down with him, for he was no less fond of cow heel and calf's feet than Sancho was. While at supper, Don Juan asked Don Quixote what news he had of the lady Dulcinea del Toboso. Was she married? Had she been brought to bed? Or was she with child? Or did she, in maidenhood, still preserving her modesty and delicacy, cherish the remembrance of the tender passion of Senor Don Quixote? To this he replied, "Dulcinea is a maiden still, and my passion more firmly rooted than ever, our intercourse unsatisfactory as before, and her beauty transformed into that of a foul country wench." And then he proceeded to give them a full and particular account of the enchantment of Dulcinea, and of what had happened him in the cave of Montesinos, together with what the sage Merlin had prescribed for her disenchantment, namely the scourging of Sancho. Exceedingly great was the amusement the two gentlemen derived from hearing Don Quixote recount the strange incidents of his history, and if they were amazed by his absurdities, they were equally amazed by the elegant style in which he delivered them. On the one hand, they regarded him as a man of wit and sense, and on the other, he seemed to them a maundering blockhead, and they could not make up their minds whereabouts between wisdom and folly they ought to place him. Sancho, having finished his supper and left the landlord in the X condition, repaired to the room where his master was, and as he came in said, "May I die, sirs, if the author of this book your worships have got as any mind that we should agree, as he calls me glutton. I wish he may not call me drunkard too." "But he does," said Don Geronimo. "I cannot remember, however, in what way, though I know his words are offensive, and what is more, lying, as I can see plainly by the physiognomy of the worthy Sancho before me." "Believe me," said Sancho, "the Sancho and the Don Quixote of this history must be different persons from those that appear in the one Hamate Benegali wrote, who are ourselves, my master valiant, wise, and true in love, and I simple, droll, and neither glutton nor drunkard." "I believe it," said Don Juan, "and were it possible, an order should be issued that no one should have the presumption to deal with anything relating to Don Quixote, save his original author Cid Hamete, just as Alexander commanded that no one should presume to paint his portrait save Apelles." "Let him who will paint me," said Don Quixote, "but let him not abuse me, for patience will often break down when they heap insults upon it." "None can be offered to Señor Don Quixote," said Don Juan, "that he himself will not be able to avenge, if he does not ward it off with the shield of his patience, which I take it is great and strong." A considerable portion of the night passed in conversation of this sort, and though Don Juan wished Don Quixote to read more of the book to see what it was all about, he was not to be prevailed upon, saying that he treated it as read and pronounced it utterly silly, and if by any chance it should come to its author's ears that he had it in his hand, he did not want him to flatter himself with the idea that he had read it, for our thoughts, and still more our eyes, should keep themselves aloof from what is obscene and filthy. They asked him whither he meant to direct his steps. He replied to Saragossa, to take part in the harness jousts which were held in that city every year. Don Juan told him that the new history described how Don Quixote, let him be who he might, took part there in the tilting at the ring, utterly devoid of invention, poor in mottos, very poor in costume, though rich in silliness. "For that very reason," said Don Quixote, "I will not set foot in Saragossa, and by that means I shall expose to the world the lie of this new history writer, and people will see that I am not the Don Quixote he speaks of." "You will do quite right," said Don Geronimo, "and there are other jousts at Barcelona in which Señor Don Quixote may display his prowess." "That is what I mean to do," said Don Quixote, "and as it is now time, I pray your worships to give me leave to retire to bed, and to place and retain me among the number of your greatest friends and servants." "And me too," said Sancho. "Maybe I'll be good for something." With this they exchanged farewells, and Don Quixote and Sancho retired to their room, leaving Don Juan and Don Geronimo amazed to see the medley he made of his good sense and his craziness, and they felt thoroughly convinced that these, and not those their Aragonese author described, were the genuine Don Quixote and Sancho. Don Quixote rose betimes, and bade adieu to his host by knocking at the partition of the other room. Sancho paid the landlord magnificently, and recommended him either to say less about the providing of his inn, or to keep it better provided.
好，呢一節咧，作者喺度用一啲小詭計去改變讀者對佢呢個故事嘅睇法。首先就講啊，Don Quixote同 Sancho 兩個人嘅狀況先啦。因為上一回就係兩個咧本身傷痕，咁就好潦倒嘅狀態。但係 Sancho 佢嘅性格就係樂天嘅，唔理得咁多，餵飽自己先。Don Quixote相對就意志消沉啦，有少少悲天憫人，覺得自己點會落得咁嘅下場，咁啊唔想食嘢，甚至乎餓死在所不惜。當然就俾阿 Sancho 點醒咗啦。之後兩個人就投宿喺路上嘅小客棧，只係得到一啲好些微嘅食糧。入咗房休息之後，佢哋就聽到隔離房，其實就唔係隔離房，只係一間房咧就間開咗嘅啫。有兩個人喺度對話， 佢哋嘅內容就係講佢係睇緊當吉訶德嘅呢本書，當吉訶德編年史，當吉訶德傳記，討論緊呢個第二部就冇第一部啊，冇睇啊，又話咧 Sancho 個太太個名係有啲出入，冇咁好睇啊，就因為當吉訶德已經失卻咗佢對 Dulcinea 嘅愛啊。聽到呢句說話，當吉訶德就即刻彈起咁啊，同我哋講，究竟你哋講緊乜嘢啊？冇啲咁嘅事喎。然之後就攞本書嚟睇，發覺咧書入面有好多資訊會同現實不符。不過重點就嚟啦，書入面咧有提到當吉訶德係正係上路去 Saragossa 就去進行決鬥表演，但係咧佢既然咁唔中意呢一本書嘅內容，佢就偏要去另外一個地方去進行決鬥。佢就決定去巴塞隆納，就唔去 Saragossa。咁呢一度咧，我覺得作者好似玩嘅一啲小把戲。當然佢又再次突破4埲牆啊，利用咗個同房嘅人物，就改變咗當吉訶德一啲想法啊，或者啲路線嘅軌跡，直接用讀者嘅聲音去改變自己嘅寫法。換轉係今時今日就好平常嘅啫，但係擺喺17世紀嚟講咧，呢個手法都算係好貼近讀者，好貼近輿論，而且嗰個鬼轉呢個手法都屬於高潮。好，我哋睇下呢啲知道啲咩字同大家分享。Forlorn F-O-R-L-O-R-N 形容詞 pitifully sad and abandoned or lonely, unlikely to succeed or be fulfilled。孤苦伶仃呢個字形容一開始當吉訶德同 Sancho 佢哋兩個獨自上路嘅嗰種凄戚啦。Paunch P-A-U-N-C-H 名詞 a large or protruding belly 大肚腩啊。如果係動詞就有啲殘忍啦。Disembowel 將一啲動物咧劏開咗個肚咁樣。Physiognomy P-H-Y-S-I-O-G-N-O-M-Y 嗰個 G 字係 silent 嘅，名詞嚟嘅。A person's facial features or expression, especially when regarded as indicative of character or ethnic origin。形容一個人嘅相貌嘅特徵，特徵咧係可以令你睇得出呢個人嘅性格係佢品性，又或者佢嘅族裔啦。中文就冇見到一個100% 嘅翻譯，只係相貌啊、面相學，咁但係實際上我諗近乎一種學術性嘅一個字啦。好，我哋呢一節到呢度，下一節再同大家讀你聽，拜拜。大家好，讀你聽2.0，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote。我哋讀到 Part 2嘅第60節，呢節嘅名叫做 Of What Happened Don Quixote on His Way to Barcelona。上一回就講到 Sancho 同 Don Quixote 喺客棧嘅房入面聽到夾住一塊屏風嘅室友啦，可以咁講，佢哋嘅對話。佢哋咧就睇緊有關 Don Quixote 嘅書，好似傳記咁嘅書，裏面嘅內容同事實出現變差。而呢個作者個身份咧，亦都令人覺得好懷疑佢個出身，好懷疑。最後都提到當吉訶德係正係往緊 Saragossa 嘅路上進發，呢一點咧反而係正確嘅。但係因為先前種種嘅偏差咧，令到當吉訶德不如就唔去 Saragossa，唔想俾人知道佢嘅行蹤，想呢個作者唔好俾佢得逞，就決定改為去 Barcelona， 當然係去施展佢嘅遊俠精神。進行佢嘅決鬥 jousting， 就令到佢自己更加出名，更加可以表揚騎士精神。我哋睇下呢一節，自從兩人喺路上發生啲咩事。
It was a fresh morning, giving promise of a cool day, as Don Quixote quitted the inn, first of all taking care to ascertain the most direct road to Barcelona without touching upon Saragossa.So anxious was he to make out this new historian, who they said abused him so, to be a liar. Well, as it fell out, nothing worthy of being recorded happened to him for 6 days, at the end of which, Having turned aside out of the road, he was overtaken by night in a thicket of oak or cork trees. For on this point, Theatre Mate is not as precise as he usually is on other matters. Master and men dismounted from their beasts, and as soon as they had settled themselves at the foot of the trees, Sancho, who had had a good noontide meal that day, let himself, without more ado, pass the gates of sleep. But Don Quixote, whom his thoughts, far more than hunger, kept awake, could not close an eye, and roamed in fancy to and fro through all sorts of places. At one moment it seemed to him that he was in the cave of Montesinos and saw Dulcinea, transformed into a country wench, skipping and mounting upon her she-ass. Again that the words of the sage Merlin were sounding in his ears, setting forth the conditions to be observed and the exertions to be made for the disenchantment of Dulcinea. He lost all patience when he considered the laziness and wants of charity of his squire Sancho, for to the best of his belief he had only given himself 5 lashes, a number paltry and disproportioned to the vast number required. At this thought he felt such vexation and anger that he reasoned the matter thus: if Alexander the Great cut the Gordian knot, saying, to cut comes to the same thing as to untie, and yet did not fail to become Lord Paramount of all Asia, neither more nor less could happen now in Dulcinea's disenchantment if I scourge Sancho against his will, for, if it is the condition of the remedy that Sancho shall receive 3,000 and odd lashes, what does it matter to me whether he inflicts them himself, or someone else inflicts them, when the essential point is that he receives them, let them come from whatever quarter they may. With this idea he went over to Sancho, having first taken Rocinante's reins and arranged them so as to be able to flog him with them, and began to untie the points by which his breeches were held up. But the instant he approached them, Sancho woke up in his full senses and cried out, "What is this? Who is touching me and untrussing me?" "It is I," said Don Quixote, "and I come to make good thy shortcomings and relieve my own distresses. I come to whip thee, Sancho, and wipe up some portion of the debt thou hast undertaken. Dulcinea is perishing, thou art living on regardless. I am dying of hope deferred. Therefore untrust thyself with a good will, for mine it is, here, in this retired spot, to give thee at least 2,000 lashes. "Not a bit of it," said Sancho. "Let your worship keep quiet, or else by the living God the deaf shall hear us. The lashes I pledge myself to must be voluntary and not forced upon me, and just now I have no fancy to whip myself. It is enough if I give you my word to flog and flap myself when I have the mind." "It will not do to leave it to thy courtesy, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "for thou art hard of heart, and though a clown, tender of flesh." And at the same time he strove and struggled to untie him. Seeing this, Sancho got up, and grappling with his master, he gripped him with all his might in his arms, giving him a trip with the heel, stretched him on the ground on his back, and pressing his right knee on his chest, held his hands in his own so that he could neither move nor breathe. "How now, traitor!" exclaimed Don Quixote. "Dost thou revolt against thy master and natural lord? Dost thou rise against him who gives thee his bread?" "I neither put down king nor set up king," said Sancho. "I only stand up for myself, who am my own lord. If your worship promises me to be quiet and not to offer to whip me now, I'll let you go free and unhindered. If not, traitor and Dona Sancho's foe, thou diest on the spot." Don Quixote gave his promise, and swore by the life of his thoughts not to touch so much as a hair of his garments, and to leave him entirely free and to his own discretion to whip himself whenever he pleased. Sancho rose and removed some distance from the spot, but as he was about to place himself leaning against another tree, he felt something touch his head, and putting up his hands encountered somebody's 2 feet of shoes and stockings on them. He trembled with fear and made for another tree, where the very same thing happened to him, and he fell a-shouting, calling upon Don Quixote to come and protect him. Don Quixote did so, and asked him what had happened to him, and what he was afraid of. Sancho replied that all the trees were full of men's feet and legs. Don Quixote felt them, and guessed at once what it was, and said to Sancho, "Thou hast nothing to be afraid of, For these feet and legs that thou feelest, but canst not see, belong, no doubt, to some outlaws and freebooters that have been hanged on these trees. For the authorities in these parts are wont to hang them up by 20s and 30s when they catch them, whereby I conjecture that I must be near Barcelona. And it was, in fact, as he supposed. With the first light they looked up and saw that the fruit hanging on those trees were freebooters' bodies. And now day dawned, and if the dead freebooters had scared them, their hearts were no less troubled by upwards of 40 living ones, who all of a sudden surrounded them, and in the Catalan tongue bade them stand and wait until their captain came up. Don Quixote was on foot with his horse unbridled and his lance leaning against a tree, and in short completely defenceless. He thought it best, therefore, to fold his arms and bow his head and reserve himself for a more favourable occasion and opportunity. The robbers made haste to search Dapple, and did not leave him a single thing of all he carried in the alforjas and in the valise. And lucky it was for Sancho that the Duke's crowns and those he brought from home were in the girdle that he wore round him. But for all that, these good folk would have stripped him, and even looked to see what he had hidden between the skin and flesh, but for the arrival at that moment of the captain, who was about 34 years of age, apparently strongly built, above the middle height, of stern aspect and swarthy complexion. He was mounted upon a powerful horse, and had on a coat of mail, with 4 of the pistols they call petronels in that country at his waist. He saw that his squires were about to rival Sancho Panza, but he ordered them to desist, and was at once obeyed, so the girdle escaped. He wondered to see the lance leaning against a tree, the shield on the ground, and Don Quixote in armour and dejected, with the saddest and most melancholy face that sadness itself could produce. And going up to him, he said, "Be not so cast down, good man, for you have not fallen into the hands of any inhuman Busiris, but into Roque Guinards, which are more merciful than cruel." "The cause of my dejection," returned Don Quixote, "is not that I have fallen into thy hands, O valiant Roque, whose fame is bounded by no limits on earth, but that my carelessness should have been so great that thy soldiers should have caught me unbridled, when it is my duty, according to the rule of knight-errantry which I profess, to be always on the alert and at all times my own senator. For let me tell thee, great Roque, had they found me on my horse with my lance and shield, it would not have been very easy for them to reduce me to submission. For I am Don Quixote of La Mancha, he who hath filled the whole world with his achievements." Roque Guinard at once perceived that Don Quixote's weakness was more akin to madness than to swagger, and though he had sometimes heard him spoken of, he never regarded the things attributed to him as true, nor could he persuade himself that such a humour could become dominant in the heart of man. He was extremely glad, therefore, to meet him and test at close quarters what he had heard of him at a distance. So he said to him, "Despair not, valiant knight, nor regard as an untoward fate the position in which thou findest thyself. It may be that by these slips thy crooked fortune will make itself straight. For heaven by strange circuitous ways, mysterious and incomprehensible to men, raises up the fallen and makes rich the poor." Don Quixote was about to thank him, when they heard behind them a noise as of a troop of horses. There was, however, but one, riding on which at a furious pace came a youth, apparently about 20 years of age, clad in green damask, edged with gold and breeches and a loose frock, with a head looped up in a Walloon fashion, tight-fitting polished boots, gilt spurs, dagger and sword, and in his hand a musketoon and a pair of pistols at his waist. Roque turned round at the noise and perceived this comely figure, which, drawing near, thus addressed him. "I came in quest of thee, valiant Roque, to find in thee, if not a remedy, at least relief in my misfortune, and not to keep thee in suspense, for I see thou dost not recognize me. I will tell thee who I am. I am Claudia Jeronima, the daughter of Simon Fort, thy good friend, and special enemy of Roque Torreras, who is thine also as being of the faction opposed to thee. Thou knowest that this Torreras has a son who is called, or at least was not to our sins, Don Vicente Torreras. Well, to cut short the tale of my misfortune, I will tell thee in a few words what this youth has brought upon me. He saw me, he paid court to me, I listened to him, and unknown to my father, I loved him. For there is no woman, however secluded she may live or close she may be kept, who will not have opportunities and to spare for following her headlong impulses. In a word, he pledged himself to be mine, and I promised to be his, without carrying matters any further. Yesterday I learned that, forgetful of his pledge to me, he was about to marry another, and that he was to go this morning to plight his troth, intelligence which overwhelmed and exasperated me. My father not being at home, I was able to adopt this costume, you see, and urging my horse to speed, I overtook Don Vincent about a league from this, and without waiting to utter reproaches or hear excuses, I fired this musket at him, and these 2 pistols besides, and to the best of my belief, I must have lodged more than 2 bullets in his body, opening doors to let my honor go free, enveloped in his blood. I left him there in the hands of his servants, who did not dare and were not able to interfere in his defense, and I come to seek from thee a safe conduct into France, where I have relatives with whom I can live, and also to implore thee to protect my father, so that Don Vincent's numerous kinsmen may not venture to wreak their lawless vengeance upon him. Roque, filled with admiration at the gallant bearing, high-spirited, comely figure, and adventure of the fair Claudia, said to her, Come, Signora, let us go and see if thy enemy is dead, and then we will consider what will be best for thee. Don Quixote, who had been listening to what Claudia said and Roque Guinard said in reply to her, exclaimed, Nobody need trouble himself with the defense of this lady, for I take it upon myself. Give me my horse and arms, and wait for me here. I will go in quest of this knight, and dead or alive I will make him keep his word plighted to so great beauty. Nobody need have any doubt about that, said Sancho, for my master has a very happy knack of matchmaking. It's not many days since he forced another man to marry, who in the same way backed out of his promise to another maiden. And if it had not been for his persecutors, the enchanters, changing the man's proper shape into a lackey's, the said maiden would not be one this minute. Roque, who was paying more attention to the fair Claudia's adventure than to the words of master or man, did not hear them, and ordering his squires to restore to Sancho everything they had stripped Dapple of, he directed them to return to the place where they had been quartered during the night, and then set off with Claudia at full speed in search of the wounded or slain Don Vincent. They reached the spot where Claudia met him, but found nothing there save freshly spilled blood. Looking all round, however, they descried some people on the slope of a hill above them, and concluded, as indeed it proved to be, that it was Don Vincent, whom either dead or alive his servants were removing to attend to his wounds or to bury him. They made haste to overtake them, which, as the party moved slowly, they were able to do with ease. They found Don Vincent in the arms of his servants, whom he was entreating in a broken, feeble voice to leave him there to die, as the pain of his wounds would not suffer him to go any farther. Claudia and Roque threw themselves off their horses and advanced towards him. The servants were overawed by the appearance of Roque, and Claudia was moved by the sight of Don Vincent, and going up to him half tenderly, half sternly, she seized his hand and said to him, Hadst thou given me this according to our compact, thou hadst never come to this pass. The wounded gentleman opened his all but closed eyes, and recognizing Claudia, said, I see clearly, fair and mistaken lady, that it is thou that hast slain me, a punishment not merited or deserved by my feelings towards thee, for never did I mean to, nor could I, wrong thee in thought or deed. It is not true then, said Claudia, that thou wert going this morning to marry Leonora, the daughter of the rich Balfastro. Assuredly not, replied Don Vincent. My cruel fortune must have carried those tidings to thee to drive thee in thy jealousy to take my life. And to assure thyself of this, press my hands and take me for thy husband if thou wilt. I have no better satisfaction to offer thee for the wrong thou fanciest thou hast received from me. Claudia wrung his hands, and her own heart was so wrung that she lay fainting on the bleeding breast of Don Vincent, whom a death spasm seized the same instant. Roque was in perplexity and knew not what to do. The servants ran to fetch water to sprinkle their faces, and brought some and bathed them with it. Claudia recovered from her fainting fit, but not so Don Vincent from the paroxysm that had overtaken him, for his life had come to an end. On perceiving this, Claudia, when she had convinced herself that her beloved husband was no more, rent the air with her sighs and made the heavens ring with her lamentations. She tore her hair and scattered it to the winds. She beat her face with her hands and showed all the signs of grief and sorrow that could be conceived to come from an afflicted heart. "Cruel, reckless woman," she cried, "how easily wert thou moved to carry out a thought so wicked! O furious force of jealousy, to what desperate lengths dost thou lead those that give thee lodging in their bosoms? O husband, whose unhappy fate in being mine hath borne thee from the marriage bed to the grave." So vehement and so piteous were the lamentations of Claudia that they drew tears from Roque's eyes, unused as they were to shed them on any occasion. The servants wept, Claudia swooned away again and again, and the whole place seemed a field of sorrow and an abode of misfortune. In the end, Roque directed Don Vincent's servants to carry his body to his father's village, which was close by, for burial. Claudia told him she meant to go to the monastery of which an aunt of hers was abbess, where she intended to pass her life with a better and everlasting spouse. He applauded her pious resolution, and offered to accompany her whithersoever she wished, and to protect her father against the kinsmen of Don Vincent and all the world, should they seek to injure him. Claudia would not on any account allow him to accompany her, and thanking him for his offers as well as she could, took leave of him in tears. The servants of Don Vincent carried away his body, and Roque returned to his comrades, and so ended the love of Claudia Geronima. But what wonder, when it was the insuperable and cruel might of jealousy that wove the web of her sad story. Roque Guinart found his squires at the place to which he had ordered them, and Don Quixote on Rocinante in the midst of them, delivering a harangue to them in which he urged them to give up a mode of life so full of peril, as well to the soul as to the body. But as most of them were Gascons, rough lawless fellows, his speech did not make much impression on them. Roque, on coming up, asked Sancho if his men had returned and restored to him the treasures and jewels they had stripped off Dapple. Sancho said they had, but that 3 handkerchiefs that were worth 3 cities were missing. "What are you talking about, man?" said one of the bystanders. "I have got them, and they are not worth 3 reals." "That is true," said Don Quixote, "but my squire values them at the rate he says, as having been given me by the person who gave them." Roque Guinart ordered them to be restored at once, and making his men fall in line, he directed all the clothing, jewelry, and money that they had taken since the last distribution to be produced, and making a hasty valuation and reducing what could not be divided into money, he made shares for the whole band so equitably and carefully that in no case did he exceed or fall short of strict distributive justice. When this had been done, and all left satisfied, Roque observed to Don Quixote, "If this scrupulous exactness were not observed with these fellows, there would be no living with them." Upon this Sancho remarked, "From what I have seen here, justice is such a good thing that there is no doing without it, even among the thieves themselves." One of the squires heard this, and raising the butt end of his harquebus, would no doubt have broken Sancho's head with it, had not Roque Guinart called out to him to hold his hand. Sancho was frightened out of his wits, and vowed not to open his lips so long as he was in the company of these people. At this instant 1 or 2 of those squires, who were posted as sentinels on the roads, to watch who came along them and report what passed to their chief, came up and said, "Señor, there is a great troop of people not far off coming along the road to Barcelona." To which Roque replied, "Hast thou made out whether they are of the sort that are after us, or of the sort we are after?" "The sort we are after," said the squire. "Well then, away with you all," said Roque, "and bring them here to me at once without letting one of them escape." They obeyed, and Don Quixote, Sancho, and Roque, left by themselves, waited to see what the squires brought. And while they were waiting, Roque said to Don Quixote, It must seem a strange sort of life to Señor Don Quixote, this of ours, strange adventures, strange incidents, and all full of danger. And I do not wonder that it should seem so, for in truth I must own there is no mode of life more restless or anxious than ours. What led me into it was a certain thirst for vengeance, which is strong enough to disturb the quietest hearts. I am by nature tender-hearted and kindly, but, as I said, the desire to revenge myself for a wrong that was done me so overturns all my better impulses that I keep on in this way of life in spite of what conscience tells me. And as one death calls to another, and one sin to another sin, revenges have linked themselves together, and I have taken upon myself not only my own, but those of others. It pleases God, however, that, though I see myself in this maze of entanglements, I do not lose all hope of escaping from it and reaching a safe port. Don Quixote was amazed to hear Roque utter such excellent and just sentiments, for he did not think that among those who followed such trades as robbing, murdering, and waylaying, there could be anyone capable of a virtuous thought, and he said in reply, "Señor Roque, the beginning of health lies in knowing the disease and in the sick man's willingness to take the medicines which the physician prescribes. You are sick, you know what ails you, and heaven, or more properly speaking God, who is our physician, will administer medicines that will cure you, and cure gradually, and not of a sudden or by a miracle. Besides, sinners of discernment are nearer amendment than those who are fools, and as your worship has shown good sense in your remarks, all you have to do is to keep up a good heart and trust that the weakness of your conscience will be strengthened. And if you have any desire to shorten the journey and put yourself easily in the way of salvation, come with me, and I will show you how to become a knight-errant, a calling wherein so many hardships and mishaps are encountered that if they be taken as penances, they will launch you in heaven in a trice." Roque laughed at Don Quixote's exhortation, and changing the conversation he related the tragic affair of Claudia Jeronima, at which Sancho was extremely grieved, for he had not found the young woman's beauty, boldness, and spirit at all amiss. And now the squires dispatched to make the prize came up, bringing with them 2 gentlemen on horseback, 2 pilgrims on foot, and a coach full of women with some 6 servants on foot and on horseback in attendance on them, and a couple of muleteers whom the gentlemen had with them. The squires made a ring round them, both victors and vanquished maintaining profound silence, waiting for the great Roque to speak. He asked the gentlemen who they were, whither they were going, and what money they carried with them. "Señor," replied one of them, "we are 2 captains of Spanish infantry. Our companies are at Naples, and we are on our way to embark in 4 galleys, which they say are at Barcelona under orders for Sicily, and we have about 200 or 300 crowns, with which we are, according to our notions, rich and contented, for a soldier's poverty does not allow a more extensive hoard." Roque asked the pilgrims the same questions he had put to the captains, and was answered that they were going to take ship for Rome, and that between them they might have about 60 reals. He asked also who was in the coach, whither they were bound, and what money they had, and one of the men on horseback replied, "The persons in the coach are my lady Dona Guiomar de Guinones, wife of the regent of the Vicariate at Naples, her little daughter, a handmaid, and a duenna. We 6 servants are in attendance upon her, and the money amounts to 600 crowns. "So then," said Roque "we have got here 900 crowns and 60 reals. My soldiers must number some 60. See how much there falls to each, for I am a bad arithmetician." As soon as the robbers heard this, they raised a shout of "Long live to Roque in spite of the Iadre that seek his ruin." The captains showed plainly the concern they felt. The regent's lady was downcast, and the pilgrims did not at all enjoy seeing their property confiscated. Roque kept them in suspense in this way for a while, but he had no desire to prolong their distress, which might be seen a bowshot off, and turning to the captains he said, "Sirs, will your worships be pleased of your courtesy to lend me 60 crowns, and her ladyship the regent's wife 80, to satisfy this band that follows me, for it is by his singing the abbot gets his dinner, and then you may at once proceed on your journey, free and unhindered, with a safe conduct which I shall give you. so that if you come across any of the bands of mine that I have scattered in these parts, they may do you no harm. For I have no intention of doing injury to soldiers or to any woman, especially one of quality. Profuse and hearty were the expressions of gratitude with which the captains thanked Roque for his courtesy and generosity. For such they regarded his leaving them their own money. Senora Donna Guiomar de Quinones wanted to throw herself out of the coach to kiss the feet and hands of the great Roque, but he would not suffer it on any account. So far from that, he begged her pardon for the wrong he had done her under pressure of the inexorable necessities of his unfortunate calling. The regent's lady ordered one of her servants to give the 80 crowns that had been assessed as her share at once, for the captains had already paid down their 60. The pilgrims were about to give up the whole of their little hoard, but Roque bade them keep quiet, and turning to his men he said, "Of these crowns 2 fall to each man, and 20 remain over. Let 10 be given to these pilgrims, and the other 10 to this worthy squire, that he may be able to speak favourably of this adventure." And then, having writing materials with which he always, when provided, brought to him, he gave them in writing a safe conduct to the leaders of his bands, and bidding them farewell, let them go free and filled with admiration at his magnanimity, his generous disposition, and his unusual conduct, and inclined to regard him as an Alexander the Great rather than a notorious robber. One of the squires observed in his mixture of Gascon and Catalan, "This captain of ours would make a better friar than highwayman. If he wants to be so generous another time, let it be with his own property and not ours." The unlucky wight did not speak so low, but that Roque overheard him, and drawing his sword almost split his head in two, saying, "That is the way I punish impudent saucy fellows." They were all taken aback, and not one of them dared to utter a word. Such deference did they pay him. Roque then withdrew to one side and wrote a letter to a friend of his at Barcelona, telling him that the famous Don Quixote of La Mancha, the knight-errant of whom there was so much talk, was with him, and was, he assured him, the drollest and wisest man in the world, and that in 4 days from that date, that is to say, on St. John the Baptist's Day, he was going to deposit him in full armour mounted on his horse Rocinante, together with his squire Sancho on an ass, in the middle of the strand of the city, and bidding him give notice of this to his friends the Neros, that they might divert themselves with him. He wished, he said, his enemies the Cadelles could be deprived of this pleasure, but that was impossible, because the crazes and shrewd sayings of Don Quixote and the humours of his squire Sancho Panza could not help giving general pleasure to all the world. He dispatched the letter by one of his squires, who, exchanging the costume of a highwayman for that of a peasant, made his way into Barcelona and gave it to the person to whom it was directed.
好，呢一節就發生咗好多事。首先呢，自從兩人過咗6日相安無事嘅日子，有一日Don Quixote就瞓着覺，諗住Dulcinea，諗住佢所受到嘅詛咒，而解咒嘅方法當然就係 Sancho 要自己鞭自己成1000下咁樣，佢就心急起上嚟咧，就想對已經熟睡嘅 Sancho 落手就鞭佢。Sancho 竟然就反制翻Don Quixote，就話應承我唔好再逼我鞭自己啦。咒語嗰個條件就係只要我自己想鞭自己先至有用，嗰咪係冇用。Don Quixote只能夠就範，就話唔想鞭佢。Sancho 嘅後咧就想鞭自己先再鞭啦嚇。佢哋冇幾耐咧就見到咦樹上面好似掛咗好多類似屍體咁嘅嘢喎，係咪啲賊人嘅屍體？但係轉個頭，佢哋唔單止俾屍體包圍住，仲俾好多活生生嘅賊人包圍住。佢哋嘅賊頭就叫做 Roque盜亦有道。正當 Roque盜亦有道喺度搶奪 Sancho 行裝嘅時候咧，有一位女士就出現。呢個女士咧就好似女扮男裝咁，佢嘅名咧叫 Claudia。佢咧就有事向賊頭Roque咧就相求。過程就係有一位男子咧叫做 Vincent， 咁啊愛上Claudia，兩個咧都係兩情相悅。但係有一日 Claudia 收到消息，就話呢 Vincent 要去娶另外一個女仔為妻。Claudia 咧就帶住支槍，一聲不響就打咗2粒子彈落去 Vincent 嗰度。而家呢一刻 Vincent 就受咗重傷啦。 Claudia 就想 Roque 保護佢自己嘅爸爸，因為咧 Claudia 知道佢殺咗 Don Vincent， 佢自己咧就要落荒而逃，係要離開噶啦。但係咧佢唔想佢自己嘅爸爸俾 Don Vincent 佢哋嘅人咧去尋仇啊，就想 Roque 去幫手。咁 Roque 呢個反應就係、我哋去睇下 Vincent 佢而家究竟在唔在生先啦，就去揾到阿 Vincent， 而 Vincent 都真係奄奄一息。佢就係喺 Claudia 懷抱度就同佢講，佢根本咧就冇意思要娶濟我女人，呢個純粹一場誤會。並且咧請阿 Claudia 喺佢臨死之前咧同佢結為夫妻，然之後咧就過身啦。咁 Claudia 咧經歷咗呢件事之後，佢就決定自己將會入去修道院嗰度獨自安慰下半生。亦都希望呢個賊頭 Roque 可以體諒佢啦，係講聲唔好意思啦，咁就離開咗。話說回來，賊頭 Roque 同 Don Quixote 不打不相識。Don Quixote 展現出佢嘅騎士精神，就勸呢一班賊人，其實你都唔係咁壞啊，亦都係算係盜亦有道。點解要做賊啊？不如去做騎士啦，好似我咁做遊俠咪幾好。當然大家都唔理佢。Roque 都會覺得 Don Quixote 呢個人真係好似傻傻地，又好有俠義精神，有一種識英雄重英雄嘅感覺。報來咧 Roque 呢一邊有探子回報，見到有路人經過，就係打劫嘅對象。Roque 就話好啦，咁你哋帶佢哋上嚟啦。佢啲手下咧就捉咗呢一班人，呢班路人上嚟。呢班路人係一啲士兵同埋一啲女士啦。Roque 咧見到咁嘅情況咧，原本係搶晒佢啲錢嘅，但係就覺得唉，既然你哋係士兵，保家衛國，而其他嘅都係一啲婦孺，姑且咧俾翻一部分嘅錢你，剩翻嘅錢咧就當係路費，我哋會陪你上路。同埋咧，我哋會叫我其他嘅手下唔會攻擊你哋噶啦，你哋可以安心上路。咁大家咧都好開心啊，亦都更加同 Don Quixote 啊，原來你係咁出名嘅 Don Quixote。好啦，我都會收信咧，同巴塞隆納入面兄弟講聲噶啦，佢哋咧唔會攻擊你嘅。我哋頭先搶你咧，俾翻晒你哋啦。好，我哋睇下呢一節有啲咩字同大家分享。Circuitous。Circuitous, C-I-R-C-U-I-T-O-U-S。頭一 part 咧好似讀 circuit 咁樣，但係發音咧係 circuitous。形容詞，形容一啲路線啊或者啲行程 ，longer than the most direct way， 意思即係有啲迂迴啦，唔係直接咁樣由一點去到另一點嘅，有啲繞道而行嘅意思。Circuitous。Insuperable。形容詞，形容一啲困難嘅事，一啲障礙咁樣。Impossible to overcome， 不可逾越嘅。Insuperable。Exhortation。E-X-H-O-R-T-A-T-I-O-N， 名詞。An address or communication emphatically urging someone to do something， 我哋中文會叫做激勵啊，督促。就文中就提到 Don Quixote 好激勵呢一班綠林大盜，希望佢哋轉職成為遊俠。但係呢班綠林大盜咧，當然就唔理睬 Don Quixote 啦。好，我呢一節到呢一度，下一次再同大家讀你聽，拜拜。讀你聽嘅時間，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 我哋讀到 Part 2嘅第61節，呢一節個名叫做 Of What Happened Don Quixote on Entering Barcelona, Together with Other Matters that Partake of the True Rather Than of the Ingenious。 咁上一回就發生咗好多事，上一回第60節最後講到 Don Quixote 同賊頭 Roque 可謂不打不相識。雙方咧交換大家嘅祝福之後，就送 Don Quixote 上路去巴塞隆納，仲話佢會交代一啲朋友啦喺嗰度接應佢哋，歡迎佢哋咁話。當然啦，亦都將之前偷咗 Sancho 嘅嘢咧原銀奉還俾佢嘅。好啦，咁我哋睇下呢一節 Don Quixote 進入巴塞隆納會發生啲咩事。
Don Quixote passed 3 days and 3 nights with Roque, and had he passed 300 years, he would have found enough to observe and wonder at in his mode of life. At daybreak, they were in one spot, at dinner time in another. Sometimes they fled without knowing from whom, at other times they lay in wait, not knowing for what. They slept standing, breaking their slumbers to shift from place to place. There was nothing but sending out spies and scouts, posting sentinels and blowing the matches of harquebuses, though they carried but few, for almost all used flintlocks. Roque passed his nights in some place or other apart from his men, that they might not know where he was. For the many proclamations the Viceroy of Barcelona had issued against his life kept him in fear and uneasiness, and he did not venture to trust anyone, afraid that even his own men would kill him or deliver him up to the authorities, or for truth, a weary, miserable life. At length, by unfrequented roads, shortcuts in secret paths, Roque, Don Quixote, and Sancho, together with 6 squires, set out for Barcelona. They reached the Strand on St. John's Eve during the night, and Roque, after embracing Don Quixote and Sancho, left them with many expressions of goodwill on both sides. Roque went back, while Don Quixote remained on horseback, just as he was, waiting for day. It was not long before the countenance of the fair Aurora began to show itself at the balconies of the east, gladdening the grass and flowers, if not the ear, though to gladden that too there came at the same moment a sound of clarions and drums, and a din of bells and a tramp, and cries of "Clear the way there" of some runners that seemed to issue from the city. The dawn made way for the sun that, with a face broader than a buckler, began to rise slowly above the low line of the horizon. Don Quixote and Sancho gazed all round them. They beheld the sea, a sight until then unseen by them. It struck them as exceedingly spacious and broad, much more so than the lakes of Ridera, which they had seen in La Mancha. They saw the galleys along the beach, which, lowering their awnings, displayed themselves decked with streamers and pennants that trembled in the breeze and kissed and swept the water, while on board the bugles, trumpets, and clarions were sounding and filling the air far and near with melodious warlike notes. Then they began to move and execute a kind of skirmish upon the calm water, while a vast number of horsemen on fine horses and showy liveries issuing from the city engaged on their side in a somewhat similar movement. The soldiers on board the galleys kept up a ceaseless fire, which they on the walls and forts of the city returned, and a heavy cannon rent the air with the tremendous noise they made, to which the gangway guns of the galley replied. The bright sea, the smiling earth, the clear air, though at times darkened by the smoke of the guns, all seemed to fill the whole multitude with unexpected delight. Sancho could not make out how it was that those great masses that moved over the sea had so many feet. And now the horsemen in livery came galloping up with shouts and outlandish cries and cheers to where Don Quixote stood, amazed and wondering. And one of them, he to whom Roque had sent word, addressing him, exclaimed, "Welcome to our city, mirror, beacon, star, and cynosure of all knight-errantry in its widest extent. Welcome, I say, valiant Don Quixote of La Mancha, not the false, the fictitious, the apocryphal that these latter days have offered us in lying histories, but the true, the legitimate, the real one that Cid Hamete Benengeli, flower of historians, has described to us." Don Quixote made no answer, nor did the horsemen wait for one, but wheeling again with all their followers, they began curveting round Don Quixote, who, turning to Sancho, said, "These gentlemen have plainly recognized us. I will wager they have read our history, and even that newly printed one by the Aragonese." The cavalier who had addressed Don Quixote again approached him and said, "Come with us, Señor Don Quixote, for we are all of us your servants and great friends of Roque Guinard's." To which Don Quixote returned, "If courtesy breeds courtesy, yours, Sir Knight, is daughter or very nearly akin to the great Roques. Carry me where you please. I will have no will but yours, especially if you deign to employ it in your service." The cavalier replied with words no less polite, and then, all closing in round him, they set out with him for the city, to the music of the clarions and the drums. As they were entering it, the wicked one, who is the author of all mischief, and the boys who are wickeder than the wicked one, contrived that a couple of these audacious, irrepressible urchins should force their way through the crowd, and lifting up one of them Dapple's tail and the other Rocinante's, insert a bunch of furs under each. The poor beasts felt the strange spurs and added to their anguish by pressing the tails tight, so much so that, cutting a multitude of capers, they flung their masters to the ground. Don Quixote, covered with shame and out of countenance, ran to pluck the plume from his poor jade's tail, while Sancho did the same for Dapple. His conductors tried to punish the audacity of the boys, but there was no possibility of doing so, for they hid themselves among the hundreds of others that were following them. Don Quixote and Sancho mounted once more, and with the same music and acclamations reached their conductor's house, which was large and stately, that of a rich gentleman in short, and there for the present we will leave, for such is Cide Hamate's pleasure.
好，呢一節非常之簡短，咁就係講當Quixote同 Sancho 入城，當中就即時受到 Roque嘅朋友們嘅歡迎，咁令到佢哋都相當驚訝，因為個排場咧都相當大，現場有好多人非常之表示歡迎對於當Quixote嘅來臨，因為咧佢係原裝正版 Cide Hamate 呢個作者入面嘅人物，呢個係真實嘅人物，就唔係虛假，唔係假冒嘅。大家咧都好歡迎佢，就希望會受到佢嘅招待，請佢去佢哋嘅屋嗰度去休息。咁喺路上就有惡作劇咁啊，有啲小朋友塞嗰啲帶刺嘅植物入咗去佢哋嘅坐騎度啦，令到佢哋咧就不適跳起上嚟，咁啊將Don Quixote同 Sancho打咗落地，非常尷尬，唯有扮冇嘢啦。咁啊上馬咧繼續向 Roque嘅朋友嘅屋咧都進發。呢一節冇咩字同大家分享。好，我哋今日讀到呢度，下一次再同大家讀你聽，拜拜。